For 6 years she was the wife of one of the most powerful men in the world, but before him she became invisible. Now, assuming a new identity, she enters his company as a secretary, determined to discover a truth that could destroy everything. While he observes her every day without recognizing her, secrets from the past begin to resurface, threatening reputations, fortunes, and buried feelings. Between revenge, pain, and unexpected revelations, one question hangs in the air: who really betrayed whom? Before discovering how this intense story unfolds, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more surprising stories full of twists and turns. The elevator opened its doors on the 32nd floor, and Mara Silveira stepped out with measured steps, her black bag tucked under her arm and her shoulders upright, as if the weight of that moment did not exist. The hallway was silent, lined with white marble and lit by discreet spots that made the walls shine like mirrors. Before pressing the floor button, she looked at herself in the elevator's internal mirror for a second. The reflection that looked back was efficient, discreet, completely different from the woman who had walked through that hallway years ago with the surname Vasconcelos. She was Mara Silveira. For now. She knew every detail of that environment. The smell of air conditioning mixed with the subtle scent of treated wood, the texture of the carpet that began right after the reception, the muffled sound of printers in the background. She knew it because she had walked through there hundreds of times. But not as Mara Silveira. Before, she was Isabella Drummond Vasconcelos, wife of Rafael Vasconcelos, lady of this floor, of this company, of this story. Now, she was just another candidate for the position of executive secretary at Vasconcelos Incorporações, the largest real estate group in the state of São Paulo. She had darkened hair, a pair of prescription glasses she didn't need to wear, and an impeccable resume carefully built over 2 years. Every detail had been thought out. Every line of that document was true, but belonged to a version of her that no one knew. The receptionist, a young woman with coral lipstick and professional posture, smiled upon seeing her approach. "Good afternoon. You must be Mara Silveira, right? For the 15-hour interview?" "That's right," she replied, returning the smile naturally. "I'm a little early. I hope it's not a problem." "Of course not. Mr. Vasconcelos is in a meeting, but should finish soon. You can wait here." She sat on the beige leather sofa in the waiting area and kept her gaze steady ahead. From where she was, she could see the closed door of the meeting room. She knew exactly what that room was like inside. The oval oak table, the chairs upholstered in graphite, the panoramic window with a view of the viaduct and the buildings scattered along Avenida Paulista. She had participated in dinners there, had sat beside him while he signed contracts involving millions, and she had been discarded from there as if she had never existed. The divorce papers arrived without warning, in a sealed envelope sent by a law firm she had never heard of, without a call, without an explanation. After 6 years of marriage, the only communication was a cold legal document asking her to sign and return it within 30 days. Isabella did not sign. She kept the envelope inside a box, put the box at the back of the closet, and spent the following 2 years trying to understand what had happened to her life. In that same period, her father's company, Drummond Construções, had been absorbed by a predatory acquisition linked to the Fundação Vasconcelos, the philanthropic and urban development arm of Rafael's group. Her father, Argemiro Drummond, a man who had built his life with his own hands, found himself without a company, without partners, and without a name. His health slowly gave way, and he spent his last months carrying a guilt she never believed was fair. He believed he had failed. He believed he had been too naive, had signed documents without reading them carefully, had trusted the wrong people. He died without knowing if his name would ever be cleared. Isabella came to believe that everything was connected, that the marriage had been a trap, that Rafael knew what was being done to her family and married her on purpose, to facilitate access, to ensure no one resisted. The idea was too painful to be discarded and too scary to be confirmed without proof. Therefore she became Mara. 2 years of planning, an executive management course in Campinas taken under the new name, references built in smaller companies in the sector, a carefully cultivated network of contacts. She had prepared every step with the precision of someone who cannot afford to make a mistake, because she knew she would only have one chance. The door to the meeting room opened. Rafael Vasconcelos came out first, with his tie slightly loosened and a black folder under his arm. He had the same stature as always, that posture that occupied space without asking permission, the grey hairs at the temples that didn't exist before. 2 years had passed for him in a different way. There was something heavier in the way he carried his shoulders, a discreet tension she didn't immediately recognize. He greeted 2 executives on the way out and then turned to the receptionist, who pointed discreetly in her direction. Rafael turned his gaze. Isabella held eye contact for exactly 2 seconds before standing up calmly, extending her hand and saying, in a voice she had trained to sound different from the one he knew, "Good afternoon, Mr. Vasconcelos. I am Mara Silveira. I appreciate the opportunity for the interview." He shook her hand. He looked at her face, and he saw nothing but a competent candidate waiting to be evaluated. "You can come with me," he said, turning his back and walking toward the main office. She followed him with controlled steps, taking in every detail. Her heart beat at an accelerated rhythm that she didn't let reach the surface. She had rehearsed that moment hundreds of times, but no rehearsal had fully prepared her for the physical sensation of being so close to him again, of hearing the voice that for years was the last thing she heard before going to sleep. Inside the office, he opened the folder, took out her resume and began to read without sitting down. It was an old habit. She knew he preferred to read standing up when he needed to concentrate. She also knew he took his coffee without sugar, and that he hated it when someone knocked on the door without warning first. "You have experience with restructuring administrative processes," he said, without looking up from the paper. It wasn't a question. "Yes. In my last company, I implemented a contract management system that reduced internal approval time by 40%. How? I mapped the bottlenecks at each stage, eliminated redundant approvals, and created a digital flow with real-time tracking. The change was gradual so as not to generate resistance among the teams." He looked up for the first time since they started talking inside. "When can you start?" She didn't let the surprise show on her face. "Next Monday, if it is convenient for you." Rafael closed the folder, placed it on the table and crossed his arms. "We have a serious organizational problem in the sector of contracts inherited from old acquisitions. It is a job that will require absolute discretion and the ability to handle sensitive documentation. It is not for everyone." "I understand," she said, keeping her gaze direct in his eyes, "and I believe I am prepared exactly for this type of challenge." There was a brief pause. He studied her with the pragmatic attention of someone who evaluates resources, not people, and then he nodded. "Monday, 8 o'clock. Ask for Claudia at the reception. She will guide you on the integration procedures." "Thank you, Mr. Vasconcelos." She left the office with the same controlled step she had entered with. She waited for the elevator, entered, pressed the ground floor button, and stood still as the doors closed. Only then, alone in that closed space descending 32 floors, did she let her eyes get moist for a single second. He didn't recognize her. It was exactly what she needed. The following Monday, Isabella arrived at the 32nd floor 15 minutes early. She brought with her a new notebook, a black ink pen, and the same bag from the day of the interview. Claudia, the administrative coordinator, was a woman with short hair and an efficient voice who received her with a brief smile and immediately began presenting the internal systems. Isabella took everything down with attention, asking precise questions at the right time, enough to seem dedicated, but not so many as to draw unnecessary attention. The room designated for her was adjacent to Rafael's office, separated by a frosted glass door. It was a functional space, with a wide desk, 2 monitors, and a metal filing cabinet with 4 drawers. On the desk was a stack of folders identified with yellow labels, all marked with the internal seal for acquisition documentation. Claudia pointed to the set with a tired gesture. "These are the contracts for acquisitions made by the Foundation over the last 8 years. They need to be digitized, catalogued, and cross-referenced with the accounting records of the period. They have already passed through 3 people before you, and none managed to organize them enough to generate a coherent report." Isabella looked at the folders without letting any emotion show on her face. Understood. Can I have access to the digital filing system to start the cross-referencing? I will release your login today. If you need anything, my office is down the hallway on the left. Claudia left and Isabella was alone with the folders. She pulled the first one carefully, opened it on the desk and began to flip through it. The documents were dense, full of technical terms and cross-references between tax IDs and names of companies she didn't immediately recognize. But there was a method in that work, a logic she needed to find. She started with the simplest, separating the contracts by signature date, then by the company involved, then by the type of operation. She spent the first 3 hours just physically organizing the material on the desk, without yet touching the computer. When Raphael opened the office door for the first time that morning, she was with her back to him, fixing labels on a new organization of the folders. "Good morning, Mara. How is the adaptation going?" "Productive," she replied, turning naturally. "I already have an initial organizational structure. I believe that by Friday I can deliver a preliminary mapping of all contracts by period." He observed the reorganized desk for a moment, nodded and went back to the office without further words. Isabella returned to work. There was something curiously painful in that interaction, not because of his coldness, but because of the normality. He treated her as he would treat any competent employee. There was no discomfort. There was nothing to indicate that he held any guilt related to what had happened to her family. She didn't know if this was innocence or a very well-developed skill. In the following days, the routine was established. Isabella arrived before 8, spent the first hours on physical documents and the afternoons on the digital system. Raphael rarely arrived before 9 and frequently left after 7. They interacted with brevity and efficiency. She presented progress. He asked specific questions. It was in the 4th week that she found the first relevant name. She was cross-referencing contracts from 2017 with accounting records when a specific tax ID appeared linked to 3 different operations in a 4-month interval. The company was called Alvorada Participações Ltda and had brokered acquisitions totaling 42 million reais. Isabella noted the number in her personal notebook and continued working as if nothing had happened. That night, in her apartment in Brooklyn, she researched. Alvorada had been registered in 2015 and closed in 2019. One of the addresses listed as headquarters coincided with a warehouse in Santo André that she had visited once at the invitation of her father-in-law, Henrique Vasconcelos, the founder of the group who had stepped away from the company in 2018, claiming health problems. She had never liked him. There was something in the way he looked at her that always seemed calculating, as if she were an element in an equation that only he saw entirely. But she needed more than address coincidences. The following week, during an integration lunch promoted by Raphael, Isabella sat next to Fabio, an analyst of active contracts, young and visibly proud of knowing things that others didn't. "You're working with the acquisition files, right?" he commented while serving his plate. "Good luck. That archive is a labyrinth." "I've noticed," she said with a light smile. "Is there any specific period that tends to be more difficult?" Fabio lowered his voice a bit, without realizing he was doing exactly what she wanted. "The ones from 2016 and 2017, they went through an internal restructuring that no one documents properly. There's stuff there that even today the legal department prefers not to touch." "Why?" "I don't know exactly. I know that when Dr. Raphael took total control in 2018, one of the first things he did was hire an external audit, but the report was never published internally." Isabella ate the rest of her lunch calmly, contributing with neutral comments when necessary. Every word had been recorded with precision. 2016 and 2017 were exactly the years when her father's company had been destroyed. Back at her desk, she opened the folder corresponding to 2016 and began to read with a different kind of attention. No longer the attention of one who organizes, the attention of one who searches. The documents from that year were more voluminous than the previous ones. There were assignment contracts, terms of consent, letters of intent, and powers of attorney attached in groups that didn't always make immediate sense. Isabella worked slowly, line by line, without skipping anything. At some point in the afternoon, the natural light was replaced by the artificial lighting of the office, and she didn't notice time passing. It was Claudia who knocked on the doorframe to warn her that the floor was almost empty. Isabella closed the last folder, recorded one more reference in the notebook and put her things away. On the way out, while calling the elevator, the doors opened, revealing Raphael inside, his jacket folded over his arm. "Working late," he said. "There is much to organize, but it is progressing. Have you found any irregularities so far?" The question was too direct to be casual. Isabella kept her gaze serene and answered carefully. "I can't state anything yet. When I have something concrete, I will present it formally." He nodded slightly. The elevator descended in silence. They went in opposite directions in the building's lobby, and Isabella crossed the revolving doors without looking back. Outside, on the busy sidewalk of Paulista, she breathed deeply. There was something in that tone that bothered her. It didn't sound like the question of a man who feared being discovered. It sounded like the question of someone who needed to know if what was buried would be found by the wrong hands before the right ones. She didn't know what that meant yet, but she knew she was in exactly the right place. The early afternoon sun entered obliquely through the office window, projecting a rectangle of light over the stacked folders. Isabella noticed it and diverted her gaze back to the screen, forcing her concentration back to the numbers. That night, lying in the apartment with the dark ceiling above her, Isabella thought about the way Raphael had asked that question. She thought about the specific weight of the words he chose, the pause before speaking, the look she couldn't completely read inside the elevator. During 6 years of marriage, she believed she knew every nuance of his communication, but the man who had said goodbye to her in that lobby was at once familiar and completely opaque. She fell asleep without an answer, but with the growing certainty that the truth was closer than she imagined. The month of May brought a humid heat that weighed over São Paulo even inside the air-conditioned offices. Isabella had completed 6 weeks at the company, and the cataloguing work was advancing in a way that began to draw attention beyond Raphael. The financial director, Marcelo Drummond, a man with a grey mustache and precise language, stopped by her desk on a Tuesday afternoon to observe the contract tracking panel she had developed in the internal system. "Is this yours?" he asked, pointing to the screen. "Yes. I created an automatic cross-referencing model between the accounting records and the physical contracts. Any discrepancy appears marked in red for manual review." Marcelo stood in silence for a few seconds, studying the structure on the screen. In 3 years of trying to organize this archive, no one had reached this. He turned his gaze to her. "Where did you get this methodology?" "From previous experiences in medium-sized companies with the same problems of accelerated acquisition. The challenge is almost always the same: growth too fast without standardization of processes." He nodded with an expression that mixed approval and something she identified as relief. "Raphael needs to see this," and he left toward the boss's office. Isabella turned her eyes back to the screen and waited. A few minutes later, Raphael appeared at her door, with Marcelo behind him. He looked at the panel, asked some technical questions, which she answered without hesitation, and then stood in silence for a moment longer than usual. "Can you present this formally at the meeting on Thursday?" "I can," she said. "At 10 o'clock, main meeting room." He left. Marcelo stayed for another moment, with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. "You know what you're doing," he said in a low voice. "That's a compliment, but also a warning. Some things in this archive were not buried by chance." Before she could respond, he also left. Isabella stood motionless before the screen for a long moment. Marcelo Drummond. She had noticed the surname when she was introduced to him in the first week, but had dismissed it as a coincidence. Drummond was a reasonably common name. But that warning, formulated with such precision, was not the comment of someone concerned with administrative organization. It was the comment of someone who knew what was inside there. She spent the night reviewing what she had documented so far. Alvorada Participações appeared in contracts signed between March 2016 and September 2017, always as an intermediary between the Fundação Vasconcelos and companies in the civil construction sector. In at least 4 cases, the acquired companies had entered a restructuring process before the negotiation, with their assets valued below market value. Drummond Construções was not listed by name in the contracts she had found so far, but there was a reference to a company called DCE Empreendimentos, which, after a quick search, revealed itself to be a subsidiary created by her father in 2014 to separate commercial projects from residential ones. There it was. Asset assignment contract signed in July 2016. DCE Empreendimentos, assigning a portfolio of projects valued at 8,300,000 reais to Alvorada Participações for a transfer value of 1,200,000 reais. Isabella stared at the numbers for a time she couldn't measure. 1,200,000 reais for a portfolio of almost 8.5 million. The difference was absurd, and the signature authorizing the assignment by DCE was her father's. But there was something wrong with that signature. She knew her father's handwriting better than anything else in the world. She had grown up looking at it on birthday cards, in notebook notes, on slips of paper left on the kitchen table. That signature was similar, but it wasn't his. She closed the laptop carefully and sat in the dark of the apartment for a long moment. If the signature had been forged, that changed everything. It meant her father had not signed that contract. It meant he had not ceded anything. It meant the destruction of his company had not been a consequence of bad decisions, but of a deliberate action conducted by someone who had access to the company's name, internal documents, and the legal structure necessary to forge a transfer of assets. She didn't know yet who had done it, but she knew the trail passed through Alvorada Participações, and Alvorada was connected to Henrique Vasconcelos's address. On Thursday morning, Isabella arrived at the meeting with an impeccable presentation. She showed the cross-referencing panel, explained the methodology, and demonstrated how the system identified discrepancies in real time. The directors present asked technical questions which she answered with precision. Rafael remained silent most of the time, observing more than participating. At the end of the meeting, when the others began to leave, he called her by name. "Mara, stay for a moment." The others left. The room became silent, just the two of them before the oval oak table she had known for years. "You are going too deep into the 2016 contracts," he said, without accusation in his tone, but also without lightness. "That is where the greatest inconsistencies are," she replied calmly. "I know." He paused. "That is why I need to know if I can trust your judgment to handle what you are going to find." Isabella looked at him for a full second before answering. "You can trust my ability to distinguish what is relevant from what is not." He studied her with that look she recognized, and that at the same time had become strange. Then he nodded slowly, as if he had decided something internally that she could not yet access. "Continue, then." She left the room with firm steps. In the hallway, she took a deep breath. He knew there was something in those contracts. The question she still couldn't answer was whether he knew because he had been part of the problem or because he had tried at some point to be part of the solution. The hallway was empty when she returned to her desk after the meeting. The office lights had that cold color of the end of a shift that made everything a little quieter than usual. Back at her desk, she opened the DCE Empreendimentos file again and printed a digitized copy of the page with the signature. She put it in her bag, along with the notebook. There was a graphologist who worked as an independent expert in Pinheiros, someone recommended by a colleague from the management course, who worked with discretion and without asking many questions. Isabella would call that very afternoon to schedule an appointment. If the signature were confirmed as false by a technical report, she would have in her hands not just a suspicion, but documented proof that the destruction of her father's company had been a deliberate action forged by people who had privileged access to the legal structures of the Vasconcelos Group. And with concrete proof, the game would change completely. She had entered that company in search of answers, but she was beginning to realize that the answers could be bigger and more complicated than anything she had imagined during the 2 years of planning. What awaited her was not a straight line between guilt and punishment. It was a labyrinth full of people who knew more than they said, and who had remained silent for reasons she still needed to understand completely. The graphologist expert was named Dr. Vera Castello, and she practiced in a small office on the second floor of a house in Pinheiros, with bookshelves up to the ceiling and a work table covered with magnifying glasses and laminated paper samples. Isabella arrived on a Friday morning with the digitized copy of the signature and a sample of what she knew to be her father's real handwriting, taken from a birthday card she had kept for years inside a box at the back of the closet. Vera examined the two samples in silence for several minutes, using a high-precision magnifying glass and then stroke analysis software on the computer. Isabella sat in the chair in front of her, hands in her lap, waiting. "There are clear discrepancies," Vera said finally without looking up from the monitor. "The pen pressure is different, the slant angle of the letters too, and this stroke here, at the end of the surname, is characteristic of a right-handed person trying to imitate the handwriting of a left-handed person. Do you know if the holder was left-handed?" "He was," Isabella replied, feeling the physical weight of the confirmation descend through her chest. "Then I can state with a high degree of technical certainty that this signature does not belong to the same person who signed the card. For an official report, I would need more samples and a full forensic analysis of the original document. But as a preliminary assessment, it is a forgery." Isabella left Vera's office with her heart beating at a rhythm she had to master before reaching the sidewalk. She stood still for a moment in front of the house, looking at the street movement without seeing anything specific. Then she called work, informing them she would arrive after lunch due to a personal commitment, and began to walk. The confirmation she had sought was there. Her father had not signed that contract. He had not ceded the company's assets. He had not made any decision that resulted in his own ruin. Someone had done it for him, forging his signature on a legal document that transferred almost $8.5 million in projects for little more than a tenth of that value. And all of this had passed through the structure of the Fundação Vasconcelos, brokered by Alvorada Participações, whose address was linked to Henrique Vasconcelos. She had arrived at the company believing Rafael might be responsible. But the more she advanced through the documents, the more the figure that emerged behind the operations was that of his father, not his. Rafael had taken total control of the group in 2018, the same year Henrique stepped away. And one of Rafael's first actions upon taking over had been to hire an external audit that was never published internally. Why hire an audit and hide the result? She returned to the office in the early afternoon and worked with concentration until the end of the shift, without giving any sign of what she had discovered. But that night, at home, she began to organize everything she had in a separate, encrypted document, which she kept on an external hard drive. Every contract, every cross-reference, every address coincidence, and now the preliminary assessment of the expert. The city continued outside, indifferent. Buses passed, people waited at the stop. Isabella stared at all this for a few minutes before resuming work. The following week, an event changed the rhythm of things unexpectedly. Rafael arrived at the office with a closed expression on a Monday morning and called an emergency meeting with the directors. Isabella was not included, which was expected, but the meeting room door remained ajar for a few minutes before someone closed it completely. She managed to hear only fragments, loose words that, combined, formed a sufficiently clear picture. An external investor had formally requested access to the Foundation's acquisition history before confirming a large-scale strategic partnership. The deadline was 30 days. Claudia passed by Isabella's desk at the end of the morning with a slightly agitated air. "Dr. Rafael wants to speed up the delivery of the internal audit report. He asked if you can have a general overview of the contracts from 2015 to 2018 ready in 2 weeks. "I can," Isabella said without hesitation. That change in deadline was, at once, a pressure and an opportunity. With the acceleration of the work, she would have formal and urgent access to all the documents she needed without having to justify why she was going deep into specific periods. The urgency created a perfect cover for what she had planned to do anyway. She worked over the next few days with an intensity that did not go unnoticed. Rafael began to appear in her office more frequently, not to supervise, but to check on progress. On one of these visits, he stood looking at the updated panel for a time too long to be just technical analysis. "Are you finding what you expected to find?" he asked in a low voice, without looking at her. Isabella paused before responding. "I'm finding what the documents show. What that means is something the report will clarify. He turned his gaze to her then, and for a second Isabella felt something she hadn't felt in the previous weeks. A crack in his usual composure. It wasn't guilt. It was something more like anticipation, as if he were waiting for her to reach a specific conclusion and knew the moment was approaching. "Mara," he said, with a slightly different intonation, more personal than professional. "When the report is ready, I want you to present it to me before anyone else, before the directors, before the board, to me." She looked at him with attention. "Why?" "Because some things need to be explained before they are revealed, and I prefer to be the one who explains." He left the room without waiting for an answer. Isabella stood motionless for a moment, processing those words. Some things need to be explained before they are revealed. It was the speech of someone who knew exactly what was in the documents, and who somehow wanted to manage what would happen when that knowledge came to light. She didn't know yet if she should trust that signal, but she knew the game had entered a new phase. That night, she mentally reviewed every detail of the conversation. Raphael's choice of words was too precise to be accidental. He hadn't said he wanted to see the report first because he was the boss, which would be the obvious argument. He had said he wanted to be the one who explains. This implied there was something to be explained, something he knew that he had carried, and that was now about to emerge from within a pile of folders that 3 previous employees had not managed to organize. She thought about the envelope with the divorce papers, about the way it had arrived without explanation, sent by an unknown law firm. For 2 years, she had interpreted that as abandonment, as the gesture of a man who discarded her after having used her. But what if the story were different? What if the distancing had been an attempt to protect her from something she still couldn't see clearly? She wasn't ready to follow that reasoning to the end. Not yet. She needed the facts first. She needed the report. She needed to understand who had forged her father's signature and why, and how that forgery had fit into a legal structure robust enough to destroy a legitimate company without leaving visible traces for years. When she had those answers, she could look at Raphael with clean eyes and decide what to do with what she would see. The report was almost ready when the first piece fell out of the place Isabella had calculated. It was a Thursday morning. She was finalizing the cross-referencing of the 2017 contracts when she found a document that shouldn't have been in that file. It was an internal letter, without an official letterhead, dated November 2017, addressed to Rafael Vasconcelos. The sender was identified only by the initials HV, but Isabella didn't need much effort to understand to whom they belonged. The letter was short and used deliberately vague language, the type of text written by someone who knew that precise words could become evidence. But the meaning was clear enough for someone who knew the context. It spoke of a series of operations conducted through an intermediary structure that had fulfilled its purpose and needed to be closed. It said that any future investigation would find only the traces that had been left intentionally, and that formal responsibility was distributed so that no central name would appear with direct exposure. And at the end, there was a specific instruction that Raphael should sign 2 attached documents to formalize the transition of control of the foundation and ensure the cycle remained closed. Isabella read the letter 3 times. Then she looked for the mentioned attached documents. They were not in the same folder. It took 40 more minutes of searching the system until she found them archived in a subfolder of closed contracts, identified by a code that did not follow the standard nomenclature of the other files. The 2 attached documents were powers of attorney. One of them authorized the definitive transfer of operational control of the Fundação Vasconcelos to Raphael, dated December 2017. The other was a statement of responsibility for operations conducted between 2015 and 2017, in which the signatory assumed knowledge of the Foundation's activities during that period. Raphael had signed both. Isabella stood still with her eyes on the screen for a time she couldn't measure. There was a knot growing in the center of her chest, the physical sensation of a narrative that was complicating in a way she hadn't completely anticipated. Raphael had signed a statement of knowledge regarding the operations from 2015 to 2017. This could mean he knew what had been done, that he had agreed to take control of the group already knowing of the schemes conducted by his father. That Henrique's departure had been an agreement, not a rupture, but there was another possible reading. If Henrique had built that structure with deliberate opacity, if he had distributed responsibilities in a calculated way so that no central name appeared with direct exposure, then it was possible that Raphael had signed those documents without fully understanding what was in their attachments. It was the kind of maneuver that a skilled lawyer and a manipulative father could orchestrate with relative ease before a son who trusted what was being presented. She didn't know which of the two readings was true, and this uncertainty was the most disturbing thing she had felt since she entered that office. That afternoon, Raphael appeared in her office around 5 o'clock. "How is the report?" "2 days left," she said. "But there is something I need to talk to you about before finalizing." He closed the office door and stood, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "Speak." "I found a letter from November 2017, sender with initials HV addressed to you. It references operations conducted by an intermediary structure and 2 attached documents that you signed." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it was dense enough to fill the entire room. "Where did you find that?" "Archived in a subfolder with non-standard nomenclature. It wasn't catalogued along with the other documents from the period." Raphael uncrossed his arms and went to the chair in front of her desk, sitting down slowly, as if he needed a moment to reorganize something internally before speaking. "I signed those documents believing they were formalizing the transition of control of the Foundation. I didn't read the attachments with the attention I should have. I had just discovered what my father had done. I was trying to contain the damage and at the same time take over the management of a company in a state of internal collapse." Isabella looked at him with attention, without speaking. "When I hired the external audit in 2018, the report confirmed what I already suspected. My father had used the Foundation structure to conduct acquisitions below market value, with forged documents and beneficiaries that the Foundation had never formally approved." He paused. "Among the harmed companies was DCE Empreendimentos." The name landed in the air between them like something that had been kept for too long. Isabella did not move. She kept her gaze fixed on him, processing what was being said. "You knew who the owners of DCE were. It wasn't a question." He answered anyway. "I found out after the audit. And when I found out, I created a compensation fund for all the harmed companies, including the Drummond family. I hired a firm to locate the beneficiaries and send the deposit." He paused again. "The money never arrived. The firm was dissolved before completing the transfers. I only discovered this months later, when I tried to confirm the transfers." Isabella felt something shift inside her, a piece that had been in the wrong place for years beginning to move to where it should have been from the start. But she wasn't ready to let that feeling appear on the surface. Not yet. There was a question that needed to be asked before anything else. "Why did you send the divorce papers without any explanation?" The silence was different this time, longer, heavier. "Because when I discovered what my father had done to her family, I understood she would have enough reasons to hate me, and because there was a real threat that he would use any link of mine with her as an instrument of pressure if I tried to expose him. Distancing her was the only way I found to keep her out of a situation that could harm her even more." Isabella remained silent for a long moment. "Her," she said slowly. "You are talking about me." The moment froze. Raphael looked at her for the first time with an expression that was no longer professional or calculated. It was the expression of a man who recognizes something forgotten and that suddenly appears with a clarity impossible to ignore. He rose slowly from the chair, looked at her face with an intensity that crossed years of distance and silence, and said the name in a low voice. "Isabella." She neither confirmed nor denied. She stayed where she was with a firm gaze and upright shoulders, letting her name resonate in the room like an accusation and a confession at the same time. She had rehearsed this moment hundreds of times, imagined the anger that would explode, the words she had prepared to say. But what she felt was something different and more complex than anything she had anticipated. It was an old pain that finally found the face of the one who should have explained it before. "How long?" he asked. "Since the first day." He closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, there was something different in them. Not guilt exactly, something closer to a weight that had been carried for a long time and that had just found a place to land. "I needed you to know," he said, "but I didn't know how to get to you without putting you at risk." Isabella breathed deeply before responding. "My father spent the last years of his life believing he had failed, believing he had signed things he shouldn't have, made wrong decisions, destroyed his own work of decades. He didn't know the signature had been forged. He didn't know he had been the victim of a deliberate maneuver. He died with a guilt that wasn't his." Raphael did not look away from her. "I know, and it is the thing I live with most." The office fell silent for a long moment. Outside, São Paulo continued with its constant noise of a city that doesn't stop, indifferent to the weight of that encounter on the 32nd floor. In the 3 days that followed, nothing between them changed visibly to anyone observing from the outside. Isabella continued at her desk, working on the report. Raphael continued in meetings, signing documents, responding to emails. They crossed paths in the hallways with the same professional composure as always. But there was a new layer in every interaction, a mutual awareness, charged with unspoken things that made every brief encounter denser than it seemed. She had spent the following nights reviewing everything she knew with different eyes. The narrative Raphael had presented in the room was coherent with the documents she had found. The structure of Alvorada Participações, the address linked to Henrique, the operations of 2016 and 2017, the external audit hired right after the transition of control. Everything fit a pattern that pointed to the father as the architect and Raphael as an heir who had discovered what he received and tried in his way to repair the damage. But there was one element she hadn't yet placed: Marcelo Drummond, the financial director who had approached her desk weeks ago to praise the panel and issue a warning. The surname was the same as hers before marriage, and the warning had been too specific to be coincidental. On Friday morning, she knocked on Marcelo's door before entering. He was on the phone, raised a finger asking for a minute, and finished the call quickly. When she entered and closed the door, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. "You are Argemiro's daughter," he said, before she said anything. Isabella stood still for a second. "Since when have you known?" "Since the 2nd week. You have your father's eyes, and the surname you use on your resume is his mother's surname, the second surname he used rarely. I recognized it when I put the two together." He indicated the chair in front of him. "Sit down." She sat. Marcelo interlaced his fingers on the desk and spoke slowly, like someone who has long carried something they are ready to put down. "Argemiro and I were partners for 8 years before he opened DCE separately. I left before the crisis, not out of dishonesty, but because of disagreements over direction. When I heard what had happened to his company, I tried to understand. But the contracts didn't make sense, the assignment was absurd, and the signature that appeared on the documents didn't match what I knew of Argemiro's handwriting." "You suspected the forgery." "I suspected it. But I had no way to prove it, and when I tried to raise questions, the process had already been legally closed." He paused. "When you appeared here, I understood it wasn't a coincidence, and I decided to wait to see how far you would go." Isabella remained silent for a moment. "You could have warned me sooner." "I could have, but I needed to be sure you had found enough on your own. A premature warning could compromise everything if you had acted with precipitation." He looked at her with something approaching respect. "You didn't precipitate anything." "What do you know about Henrique Vasconcelos?" Marcelo breathed deeply before responding. "I know he set up Alvorada as a vehicle to conduct operations that the Foundation couldn't officially do. I know he forged signatures on at least 4 different contracts, including DCE's. And I know that when Raphael found out, in 2018, he tried to repair the damage by creating a compensation fund. I myself helped Raphael structure that fund." The money didn't arrive. Marcelo closed his eyes briefly. "I know. The firm responsible for the transfers was dissolved before completing them. Raphael didn't know for months. When he found out, the window to redo the process was complicated by legal issues related to the statute of limitations of the original contracts. So you've been here all these years knowing all this. I'm here because Raphael asked me to stay. He needed someone who knew the full story and who could help him document the facts correctly when the right time came. That time, he looked at her with clarity, arrived with you. Isabella remained silent for a long moment, processing the dimension of what was being said. Marcelo had been a piece she hadn't placed on the board, but now that it was there, the image was more complete. Raphael hadn't remained static before what his father had done. He had tried to repair it. He had built a compensation structure that had failed for reasons beyond his direct control, and he had kept a man there who knew the truth, waiting for the moment to use it. There is a board meeting scheduled for next week, Marcelo said. The external investor wants a presentation of the acquisition history before closing the partnership. Raphael plans to use this meeting to formally expose what his father did, remove any trace of the structure he built, and publicly release the compensation fund. For that, he needs the report you are finalizing. Isabella looked at him with attention. He knows who I am and still needs my report. He needs it exactly because you are who you are. A report produced by the daughter of the main victim within the company's own files, with auditable methodology and cross-reference documentation, is legally incontestable. Any defense lawyer would try to question impartiality, but the technical competence of the work overcomes any argument of bias. Isabella stood still with that information for a long moment. Then she stood up, thanked Marcelo with a dry nod, and left the room. She had a report to finish, and she had decisions to make about what to do with everything she now knew. Claudia passed through the hallway with a stack of papers and nodded in her direction before entering the printing room. The routine of the floor continued its usual rhythm, completely oblivious to the weight of the conversations that had happened in that same space hours before. Back at her desk, she opened the report document and sat looking at the screen without typing anything for a few minutes. She had arrived at that office with an objective that seemed simple on the surface: find proof, confront the responsible person, reclaim what had been taken. But the reality that revealed itself was intrinsically more complex than any plot she had built in 2 years of planning. There was one person clearly responsible for what had been done. Enrique Vasconcelos had forged documents, built an intermediary structure to conduct fraudulent acquisitions, and then passed control of the company to his son in a way that distributed formal responsibility without distributing real knowledge. He had destroyed her father's company and had left a trail carefully constructed to be difficult to follow. And there was Raphael, who had inherited that mess, tried to repair it, failed in part due to circumstances beyond his control, and who had spent years carrying the weight of something his father had done, but which bore the family name. The envelope with the divorce papers, which for 2 years she had read as abandonment, began to take a different shape now that she had the context that was missing. This didn't resolve everything. It didn't erase her father's years of pain. It didn't undo what had happened to the company. It didn't bring back any day that had been lived with that unfair guilt, but it changed the direction of what she needed to do next. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathed, and began to type. The report was ready on a Wednesday afternoon. 132 pages with documentary appendices, cross-references, chronological analysis of the operations, and a specific attachment on the discrepancies identified in the 2016 and 2017 contracts. Isabella printed it, bound it in 3 copies, and left one of them on Raphael's desk before leaving that day. The next morning, he was in her office when she arrived. He was standing with the report open at the attachment section, reading in silence. She placed her bag on the chair and waited. "It is complete," he said without looking up from the page. "It is. You included everything. I included what the documents show, nothing beyond that." He closed the report and looked at her. There was something different in his expression, an openness that wasn't there in the previous weeks, as if the recognition of who she was had removed some barrier he had kept up for a long time. "Isabella," he said, using her name for the 2nd time since the night in the meeting room. "There is one thing in the report that you didn't include because you had no way of knowing." She looked at him in silence, waiting. "The compensation fund I created in 2018 still exists. The values were never distributed because the process of locating the beneficiaries stalled, but the money remained reserved in a blocked account linked to the foundation. It is 6 years of monetary update over the original value. The Drummond family is the main beneficiary. Isabella stood still, processing that information. Why didn't you redo the transfer process when you discovered the firm had been dissolved? I tried. The lawyer who had structured the fund had included a clause that required consent from the identified beneficiaries for any new transfer attempt, and the beneficiaries, at the time, included you. I didn't know where you were. You had disappeared completely after not signing the divorce papers. He paused. You never signed. No. The silence between them was different this time. There was no longer the professional composure that had served as a shield in the previous weeks. There were just two adults standing in a São Paulo office, separated by a desk, and by years of distance built from a misunderstanding that had cost too much for both. Legally, we are still married, she said. I know. That gives me the right to audit any transaction made by the group since the year my father's company was destroyed. I know that too. He didn't look away, and I will not contest that right. In fact, it is exactly what I need you to do, formally, with legal backing, at the board meeting. Isabella crossed her arms slowly, without hostility, but with the firmness of someone who still hadn't completely decided what that moment meant, beyond the practical facts. You want me to appear at the board meeting as your wife and as an auditor. I want you to appear as what you are. The person with the most right and the most technical capacity to present what is in this report. The rest is a legal detail that the board will need to record, but which does not alter the weight of what you discovered. It is not a detail, she said. 6 years are not a detail. They are not, he agreed. And I'm not asking you to treat them as if they were. I'm asking you to use what you built over the last few months to do what you came to do. The rest, what happens between us after that, is a different conversation we can have when things are in the right place. Isabella remained silent for a long moment, looking at him with the attention of someone trying to separate what they feel from what they think. Both were distinct processes, and she had learned through 2 years of planning not to let one contaminate the other. When is the meeting? Monday, 10 o'clock in the morning. I will be there. He nodded and left the room without saying anything else. Isabella stood for a moment in the silence he had left, then went to the window and stood looking at Avenida Paulista down below, with its cars and people and buildings that continued to exist, with complete indifference to what was happening 32 floors above. At the end of that afternoon, she did something she hadn't done in 2 years. She opened a drawer at home, took the box from the back of the closet, and looked at the envelope with the divorce papers. She held it for a long time. Then she placed it on the table and went to sleep without opening it. It wasn't the moment yet, but the moment was coming. On the Friday before the meeting, Enrique Vasconcelos entered the 32nd floor without warning. Isabella saw him cross the reception with a long stride and a controlled expression, greeting the receptionist with the familiarity of someone who still believes they have ownership over a place that no longer belongs to them. She stayed quiet at her desk, eyes on the monitor, and waited. His voice arrived before she could see what was happening in the hallway. Where is my son? Claudia answered something in a low voice, and then the door to Raphael's office opened and closed quickly. Isabella did not move, but she remained in absolute alert, processing every sound that came through the frosted glass wall between the two rooms. The conversation was muffled, and she couldn't distinguish words, only tones. Henrique's voice was low and constant, the type of voice that doesn't raise its tone because it doesn't need to. Raphael's voice was shorter, more controlled, with pauses she recognized as resistance. 15 minutes later, Henrique left. He passed by her office without even looking, and Raphael stayed inside the office in silence for a long time before appearing at the frosted glass door. He knows there is a meeting on Monday, Raphael said. And does he know what will be presented? Not in detail, but he knows enough to be worried. Isabella looked at him calmly. Does that change anything in the plan? No, he said, with a firmness she recognized. It changes nothing. The elevator arrived empty. She entered, pressed the ground floor button and stood in the center of the closed space as it descended, with the folder of documents in her lap and her eyes on the floor display decreasing one by one. Isabella spent the weekend reviewing every page of the report once more, not because she doubted what she had documented, but because she needed every line to be incontestable. She knew Henrique Vasconcelos would not watch an exposition of this caliber without trying to react. He had built that structure carefully enough to last years. He would not let it crumble without some kind of resistance. On Sunday night, while organizing the final version of the documents in a leather folder she had bought specifically for that occasion, she thought of her father. She thought of how he had been, before all this. A man who woke up early, who taught her to read a building floor plan before she learned to ride a bicycle, who believed that honesty and competence were enough to stay upright in the world. He had been deceived by people who used his honesty as a weakness, and he had spent the last years of his life paying a price that should never have been his. She closed the folder, placed it on the table and stood looking at it for a moment. Monday, 10 o'clock. She would be there. The meeting room on the 32nd floor was full for the first time since Isabella had arrived at the company. The board members occupied the chairs around the oval oak table. The external investor, a man in a navy blue suit named Gustavo Renault, was positioned at the head opposite Raphael, and Marcelo Drummond occupied a side chair with a closed folder on his knees. Henrique Vasconcelos had arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the corner furthest from the door with the closed expression of someone evaluating the risks of an environment before deciding what to do in it. Isabella entered last, with the leather folder and the bound report. She had changed the prescription glasses, which she didn't need to wear, for a smaller pair she used occasionally for reading, and she had left her hair in its natural tone, without the darkening she had maintained since the interview. Small changes, enough so that anyone who hadn't paid attention would notice some difference without being able to name what. Henrique noticed her when she sat at Raphael's right. She saw his gaze sweep her face quickly and then lock for a second before returning to a neutral position. He recognized her, she was sure of it, but he said nothing. Raphael opened the meeting briefly, presenting the context, the strategic partnership under negotiation, the need for transparency regarding the Foundation's history, and the internal audit methodology that had been conducted in recent months. Then he turned to Isabella. The person responsible for the internal audit will present the results. She stood up, opened the folder, and began to present. She had spent the weekend rehearsing that moment, but when the words began to come out, they came out with a naturalness that didn't need rehearsal. It was the story she knew better than any other, because it had cost years of her life to understand it completely. She explained the structure of Alvorada Participações, the brokerage contracts, the acquisitions below market value between 2016 and 2017. She showed the cross-referencing between the accounting records and the physical documents. She presented the signature discrepancies, with the preliminary report from the graphologist expert as a documented attachment. And then she reached the central point. At least 4 asset assignment contracts conducted in this period contain signatures that do not correspond, technically and graphologically, to those of the legitimate holders of the assigning companies. In all 4 cases, the intermediary company was Alvorada Participações Lita, whose headquarters address is associated with a property belonging to the founder of the group. The silence in the room was absolute. Henrique moved in his chair, but did not speak. One of these contracts involves DCE Empreendimentos, a subsidiary of Drummond Construções, which had a portfolio of projects valued at more than 8 million reais, transferred for 1/10 of that value based on a signature that did not belong to its owner. Gustavo Renault, the investor, leaned slightly forward with his elbows on the table. Are you saying that documents were forged within the structure of this foundation? The technical reports confirm the discrepancy. The legal determination of forgery belongs to an official forensic expert, which can be requested based on this report. Henrique stood up. This is an accusation without a solid legal basis, based on the analysis of an employee without forensic credentials. Sit down, Father. Raphael's voice was low, but it cut through the air of the room with a precision that silenced everything. Henrique stood still for a second, then sat down slowly, his jaw tight. Raphael stood up then and stood beside Isabella. In 2018, After hiring an external audit that confirmed irregularities in operations from 2015 to 2017, I created a compensation fund for all harmed companies. The fund exists, is documented, and was never distributed due to a failure in the transfer process. He looked at the board. The main beneficiary of this fund is the family of the woman who is presenting this report, and she is here not only as an auditor, but as a legitimate interested party in the operations of this company. There was a murmur among the board members. Gustavo Reno turned to Isabella with a calculating expression. "What is your formal link with the group?" Isabella answered without hesitation. "I am the wife of Rafael Vasconcelos, married for 8 years, never divorced by my choice. Daughter of Argemiro Drummond, original owner of DCE Empreendimentos." She looked at the board with clear eyes. "I have the legal right to audit all transactions carried out by the group, since the year my father's company was destroyed by forged documents." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It was the silence of an entire room, processing a revelation that changed the coordinates of everything that had been said in the last 40 minutes. Henrique tried to speak again. Marcelo opened the folder he had carried and distributed copies of a document that everyone received in silence. The cross-technical analysis of the irregular contracts, with the history of the compensation fund and the documentation linking Alvorada Participações to Henrique's address. The board requested a 20-minute suspension. When they returned, the chairman of the board informed that an independent review commission would be formed immediately, that the compensation fund would be released with full monetary update, that Enrique Vasconcelos would be formally removed from any advisory or representative function in the group while the commission investigated the facts, and that the partnership with Gustavo Reno was conditional on the transparent conclusion of the process. Henrique left the room without looking at anyone. Isabella stood by the table for a moment after everyone had left. Rafael was the last to stay. The room returned to the silence she knew, just the two of them before the oval table that had witnessed so many things over the years. "You knew I would come," she said, "since the beginning." He was silent for a moment. "I didn't know it was you, but I knew someone would come. And when I saw your resume, there was something I couldn't ignore. The methodology you described in the interview was exactly the type of approach someone would use if they knew what they were looking for. And even so, you hired me, because if someone with that level of determination was reaching this archive, I preferred they reached it the right way. With real access, with enough time, and with the protection of a formal link that prevented any attempt to disqualify what was found." Isabella looked at him for a long moment. "You bet a lot on this." "I bet on you," he said simply. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away. Outside the panoramic window, São Paulo stretched in all directions under a sky that was beginning to clear after cloudy days. The city didn't know and didn't care about what had happened in that room. It continued with its cars, its buildings, its people, with their own urgencies. But inside that space, something had changed permanently and irreversibly. Argemiro Drummond's name had been, for years, carried with a guilt that wasn't his. It had been associated with a failure he didn't commit, with a weakness that didn't exist, with decisions he never made because the signature on the documents wasn't his. And now, before the board, an external investor, and documented proof, that truth had been spoken out loud for the first time. There was no way to undo the past. There was no way to give back the years he had lived carrying that. But there was something that could be done. Ensure that the existing record in the world, what would remain in the documents and files, and in the memory of those who had witnessed that meeting, was the true record. Isabella took her leather folder, put it under her arm, and headed toward the door. She stopped before leaving and turned to Rafael. "The compensation fund. When it is released, I want my father's name to formally appear as the exonerated recipient, not just as a financial beneficiary, as someone to whom an injustice was done that is now being officially recognized." "It will appear," he said. "You have my word." She nodded and left. 3 months later, Isabella was sitting on a garden bench in the Araçá cemetery, on a late August afternoon with the sun beginning to give way to a soft orange over the buildings in the background. She had arrived with a simple bouquet of sunflowers, which were her father's favorite flowers, and had placed them on the stone with care before sitting down. There was much to tell. The Independent Review Commission had concluded its work in 6 weeks. The official forensic report confirmed the forgery of signatures in 4 contracts, including DCE Empreendimentos. Henrique Vasconcelos had been formally removed from any function in the group and was responding to a civil lawsuit brought by the board itself based on the Commission's findings. The partnership with Gustavo Renault had been confirmed after the presentation of the results, with a specific governance clause preventing any member of the founding family from exercising influence over operational decisions without board approval. The compensation fund had been released. Arguimiro Drummond's name appeared in the official records as an exonerated recipient, with a formal note from the company recognizing that the destruction of DCE Empreendimentos had resulted from irregular actions conducted by third parties without his knowledge or consent. It was a paragraph in a legal document, but it was the paragraph her father had deserved to have in life and which never arrived in time. Isabella remained silent for a long moment, eyes on the stone and the yellow sunflowers moving slightly in the breeze. "It wasn't the way I imagined," she said in a low voice. "No part of it was the way I imagined. But it's done, Father. Your name is clean, and I needed you to know." She stayed there for a few more minutes. Then she stood up, adjusted the stone with one of her hands, and began to walk toward the cemetery exit. Raphael was waiting for her outside, leaning against the car, hands in his pockets and gaze ahead. He had learned over the last few months that she needed some moments that were only hers, and had stopped trying to fill those spaces. It was one of the things she had noticed in him, the ability to be present without occupying the place that wasn't his. They walked together to the car without haste. The sun had descended a little more, and the São Paulo sky had that specific late afternoon color she had learned to like in the years she lived in the city, an orange that turned purple at the corners and lasted only a few minutes before becoming dark. "How are you?" he asked. "Well," she replied. And it was true in a way she hadn't been able to say honestly in a long time. There were still things to resolve between the two. There was no illusion about that. 6 years of marriage followed by 2 years of separation and a plan built in silence are not resolved in 3 months, no matter how much clearer the facts had become. There were conversations that still needed to happen, decisions that still needed to be made, trust that needed to be rebuilt with care and without haste. But there was also something that was there, between them, firm and recognizable, that had survived everything that had been built to destroy it. Isabella looked ahead as the car left the parking lot and entered the slow flow of the São Paulo afternoon. She had arrived in that city with a mission. She had found more than she expected to find, and she had come out on the other side with something she hadn't planned to carry, the full truth, without the distortions that pain imposes on facts when one does not have enough information to see them clearly. Her father's name was restored. The money had arrived. The responsible person was being held accountable. And she finally knew the whole story. It was enough to begin. There was also something she hadn't anticipated when she started all that. Lightness. Not the lightness of one who forgets, but of one who finally knows, who finally has the pieces in place and can look at the whole without gaps that distort what is seen. It was a new sensation, strange in a good way, like a muscle that aches after being used for the first time after long inactivity. Weeks later, a letter arrived by mail at her apartment. It was from the legal office that was conducting the fund release process. It informed her that the available amount, with all the years of accumulated monetary updates, had been deposited into an account in her name. There was also an attached document, the official statement from the company recognizing the injustice committed against Arguimiro Drummond and exempting him from any responsibility for the facts that led to the closure of DCE Empreendimentos. Isabella read the document 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, placed it inside a new envelope, and kept it in the box where the divorce papers she had never signed were kept. If Isabella's story touched something in you, dear listener, know that it was built with the conviction that the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way. Here on the channel, we bring stories like this every week, full of twists, emotion, and characters who don't give up even when all seems lost. If you've made it to the end of this narrative, you already know what we're capable of. Now we want to know what you thought. Leave your comment down below. Tell us what moment gripped you the most. Whether it was the recognition in the elevator, the revelation of the forged signature, or the final turn at the board meeting. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories, and leave your like so that more people can find this content. We'll see you in the next one, with a new story that will make you want to listen until the end. End of story.